Hello folks. I've talked a lot about Ordro cameras on this channel, but they aren't the only brand churning out generic cameras. There are seemingly dozens of brands making hundreds of listings on sites all over the internet. I tend to focus on Amazon, but they are available on many sites. There are many different models as well as many identical cameras that are sold under various brands. Sometimes two models can look different, but they are actually the same electronics packaged into different shells. Many of these cameras have misleading or outright deceptive marketing around them, and most of them on Amazon have multiple fake 5-star reviews. These reviews praise features which sometimes don't even exist, and it often sounds like a marketing pitch, simply reading off the specs and claiming professional results. Some of these reviews even say that these cameras are as good as or even better than name brand cameras. I've tested many of these cameras in the past, and while most of them technically work, and a couple of them have kinda okay image quality, many do not accurately represent what they are in the ads, most of them are poor value, and some of them are downright awful at any price. And some of them are ridiculously expensive for what you get. And with all the misinformation in the ads and the fake reviews, it's easy for people to think that these cameras are something that they're not. So today I'm going to try and shed some light on a couple more of these cameras. I have a camcorder from a company called this, and I have a camera that looks a little bit more like a traditional point and shoot or mirrorless camera, and this is from a brand called Lecran. But keep in mind, neither of these cameras actually say a brand name anywhere on them, so they're keeping it real generic so that they can be sold under multiple brand names. Both of these cameras are available for around $140 on Amazon. The camcorder has some interesting wording in the ad and some interesting questions and answers on Amazon that I want to share because it illustrates some of the lies that these companies have no problem throwing around in an attempt to sell these cameras. In the ad, they claim that this is the only camera on the market that can record in 4K at 60 frames per second. For someone who doesn't know a lot about cameras, that might sound like a selling point, but that claim is totally ridiculous. And we might as well get this out of the way right now. When you switch to 4K 60 on this camera, there is a crop, the quality and detail drop noticeably, the noise increases quite a bit even in good light. Plus the frame rate is an oddball number, slightly over 60, and DaVinci Resolve won't even recognize the files. So quite an odd lie for multiple reasons. Next up we have someone asking a question. They would like to know if they can buy spare batteries. The reply from the company is that it includes 2 batteries and one of them is a spare. Obviously. Here is another question about batteries. This customer would like to know if there's an external battery charger available that can charge the batteries outside the camera. Makes sense, simple question. The answer given isn't simply no, which is the correct answer by the way. They say that no camera on Amazon supports charging the batteries outside the camera. The only reason I can come up with for such a blatant lie is to dissuade this poor person from looking into other better options. Not to mention, even some of the worst cameras I've bought from Amazon come with an external battery charger. So this is just a ridiculous lie. Now it looks like the first battery guy is back, and he seems a little frustrated at the answer he received. He clarifies that he just wants to buy more batteries regardless of the fact that it comes with 2. The company reiterates that one of the included batteries is a spare, and besides, they don't recommend having more than 2 batteries. They do point out that if one of the batteries he receives is broken, he can request a return or a refund. That doesn't help him get more than 2 batteries, but they don't recommend that, so stop asking already. Here is another question that could have received a simple answer, which is no. This camera cannot take a photo while recording. However, according to the company, there are no cameras on the market that can do this. This response is extra weird because they even explain a workaround that is possible with this camera where you can pause the video to take a picture, then restart the video. And yet they still just can't resist the opportunity to claim that some feature they don't have simply doesn't exist. Now, this could just be one dishonest seller, but it's just an example of the misleading info that is out there about these cameras. Let's take a look at the cameras themselves. Both claim impossibly high 48 megapixel still photos, And as mentioned, the camcorder can sort of record 4K 60 frames per second. and this other camera advertises 1080p at 30 frames per second. I haven't opened up the camcorder yet, but the point and shoot style camera definitely has 2 metal plates screwed inside it to make it feel less like a toy. It would weigh almost nothing without them. Ultimately, the chintzy feel, the fake knobs on the top, the very clicky buttons, and the flex in the top of the camera when a flash is mounted all add up to it feeling like a toy anyway, so I don't really know that they accomplished much. The screen on this camera does flip out, but it does not rotate. The camcorder feels a little bit less flimsy overall, and the display hinge does feel pretty weak, but at least it does swivel once it is rotated out. The camcorder comes with the usual accessories that these cameras include, such as a fiddly multi-piece lens hood, a plastic handle that blocks the memory card slot and the battery, and it includes a powered microphone that sounds better than the internal microphone, but not as good as the internal mic on a 9-year-old Kodak ZI-8 camera that I bought used for $20 on eBay recently. The Lekrand camera comes with an external flash, which is unique, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to get consistent results. Like many things with these generic cameras and camcorders, the flash works, but not very well. I've had it fail to flash at times, I've had it flash out of sync often, and I even had it get stuck in a perpetual loop of flashing that I could only stop by removing the batteries. That actually happened twice. The settings on the flash itself are inconsistent and don't always work reliably. They also return to default every time you turn the flash off, so every time you turn it on, you have to readjust the settings and hope it all works. On top of that, the camera itself doesn't adjust exposure or white balance to compensate when using the flash. The results seem almost random and are very inconsistent shot to shot, even when no changes are made. At one point, I made a change to the setting on the flash, and the results got much better, so I thought I'd figured something out, but when I changed that setting back, it made zero difference. So I have no idea why the results actually improved. Later, in a similar situation, I tried every setting and was totally unable to replicate the usable results I'd stumbled on by accident before. The sync issues with the flash often leave the image partially bright and partially dark, or cause even weirder issues. So overall, it's finicky, unreliable, and in a small space, it's virtually impossible not to overexpose because the camera doesn't have any manual exposure. The touchscreen on the camcorder is often unresponsive. Menu navigation with the touchscreen is pretty finicky, and it's sometimes possible to completely miss certain menu options because the menu just kind of jumps and skips around. Fortunately, you can use these up and down buttons on the side of the camera to go up and down in the menu. But still, it's kind of unfortunate that the touchscreen is kind of unresponsive. The Lekrand camera doesn't have a touchscreen, but the interface seems almost designed around one. There's a little back button and little down buttons that you can't actually get to with the options, with the little direction buttons. And so the only way to go back is actually to completely close and reopen the menu. Some pages in the menu are kind of slow to respond, and the selection takes a second or so to move between options, and some pages the selection moves pretty quickly. The Lekrand always defaults to photo mode when you turn it off and back on. So if you take a video, turn the camera off, then turn it back on again. To take another video, it will be in photo mode, and you'll have to change it back to video mode again. In general, operation is just kind of clunky on both cameras. Both cameras claim to have anti-shake modes, which is supposed to be digital image stabilization, but like all generic camcorders and cameras that I've tested, it doesn't work. The anti-shake mode makes zero difference whether it's on or off. The Lekrand camera has face detection, and when turned on, it does draw a box around faces sometimes. It also sometimes doesn't, and it sometimes draws boxes around random stuff. I also haven't the faintest idea what the point of face detection is on this camera. There's no autofocus, which is what face detection is normally for, and from what I can tell, it doesn't have any effect on white balance or exposure either. So it's completely pointless on top of being unreliable. Most of the generic cameras I've looked at have something called beauty face, and this Lecron does have it. I've never noticed that setting having any effect on any of the cameras I've tested either, including this one. This Lecron also has a smile shutter mode that is supposed to automatically take a picture when it detects a smile. I tried for about 10 minutes, and other than grinning like an idiot over and over, I accomplished nothing. Despite all my efforts, the camera only managed to take 2 pictures, one while I wasn't smiling, and one while my face wasn't even in the frame, so I guess the camera thought that the wall has a better smile than me. Rude. The camcorder has its own unique problems. One of them is that the time and date setting doesn't save when you turn the camera off, even for a moment. This means that if you want the timestamp turned on, it will only be correct if you set the time and date every time you turn the camera on. I don't like timestamps on my videos anyways, but it's a strange issue, and it also means that the file creation dates on the video files are not correct. A much bigger issue that this camera has is the video frame rates. They are strange, non-standard, and inconsistent. For instance, when set at 30 frames per second, the file might actually be 28.45 frames per second, or 27.19, who knows? It's totally random and varies from video to video. I never saw any video match the industry standards of either 30 or 29.97 frames per second. 4K 60 behaves similarly, and it never provides right on 60 frames. The 120 and 240 frames per second modes vary as well, but they are much further off, providing more like 105 and 190 frames per second. Unfortunately, many files show up as unreadable in DaVinci Resolve. All the files I created do technically work in Premiere Pro, but as imported, they play at odd, sped-up speeds. So clearly, the non-standard frame rates are causing issues. Videos from the Lecron are a consistent 30 frames per second, and they work in all programs, so that's a plus, or at least it isn't a negative. The camcorder also has some kind of wide dynamic range processing going on. There's no setting for it in the menu or anything, but it clearly has something where it brightens the shadows during video, depending on what kind of lighting it detects in the scene. Unfortunately, it kicks in automatically and seemingly randomly as you record, and it's very noticeable. But what's worse is that it will sometimes cause an exposure pulsing at varying rates and often causes odd color pulsing as well in the shadows. It can be very distracting at times. Both of these cameras have fixed lenses with fixed focus and a minimum focus distance of around 2 to 3 feet or so. Audio from the camcorder is recorded at a bitrate of only 60 to 65 kilobits per second. But it is a 44 kilohertz sample rate, so I guess there's that. Sound from the Lecron is a higher bit rate than that of the camcorder, but the sample rate is only 16 kilohertz, so, you kind of pick your poison there. And both of them record mono only. Here is an audio sample from the camcorder here in my booth. My mouth is only about 8 inches away from the front of the camera, so this is pretty much a best case scenario. Very close to the microphone here in my sound booth, and this is the sound that it gives you. And here's a sound sample from the Lecron camera, again here in my booth, maybe 8 inches or so away from the camera. So again, best case scenario, very close to the camera here in my sound booth. This is the kind of sound that you can expect out of this Lecron camera. Now here's an audio test with the included external microphone that comes with the camcorder. And the microphone is probably, maybe 10 or 12 inches away from my mouth, and it is pointed back at me, not pointed forward. So this is how the audio sounds with the included external microphone. And the included foam windscreen is on the microphone, and there is just barely even the slightest breath of wind today. And now I've got the external microphone disconnected. I'm still holding the camera just maybe 10 inches away from my face. And this is how the internal microphone sounds on the camcorder. Here's an internal audio test of the kind of hybrid style camera. I'm holding the camera right in front of me. The camera's probably only maybe 8 to 10 inches away from my mouth. And this is how the internal audio sounds as recorded. I don't normally talk much about photo quality in these reviews, but since the Lecron is designed more like a photo camera, I figured I'd talk about it. In perfect lighting, the pictures from these cameras aren't completely terrible, but even in broad daylight there is still some noise and the color is a bit off. They both have uneven sharpness across the frame due to cheap lenses that apparently, aren't done very well, but the Lecran is worse and it is downright blurry on the left side of the image. Neither camera has optical zoom or image stabilization and no option for picture profiles or any way to adjust things like contrast or saturation, or even manual exposure. As the light drops, image quality drops as well. Even a cloudy day or typical indoor lighting results in a noticeable loss of image quality from either of these cameras with either pictures or video. Basically, pictures from either of these two cameras will probably fall behind most smartphones from the last 8 years, and a $120 point-and-shoot camera from a brand like Sony or Canon or Fuji will be better in almost every way if you want to take pictures. Both of these cameras claim to capture 48 megapixel photos, and that's just silly. At best, I'd guess these cameras have more like 8 to 12 megapixel sensors, and even those are probably older, cheaper sensors. All of the higher resolution settings in these cameras are going to be achieved through interpolation to essentially generate more pixels but add zero information. Don't get me wrong, megapixels aren't everything. I have pictures I really like that I took with a 6 megapixel camera many years ago. But just don't be fooled by the high megapixel claims of these cameras. For example, here's what passes for a 48 megapixel image from the Lecran camera in essentially the best case scenario of direct sunlight. And here's a crop of that image. Note the amount of detail in this supposedly 48 megapixel image. Here is a 9 megapixel image from a 3-generation-old smartphone. And here is a crop of that image. It's over-sharpened, but compared to the 48 megapixel image from the Lecran, there's less noise and similar detail. And just for fun, here is a 50 megapixel image created by the sensor shift high-res mode of the Olympus EM1 Mark III. And here's a crop of that image. Side by side, the difference in detail is night and day. Granted, I would not expect a $140 camera from any brand to have nearly the detail of the EM1 in high-res mode. But even the EM1 doesn't have a 50 megapixel sensor, it just fakes it by shifting the sensor around and combining multiple pictures. So I only show that image in comparison to drive home the point that the 48 megapixel claims from these cameras are totally ridiculous. You might be getting larger numbers on the File Details tab, but you aren't getting more detailed pictures. In terms of video quality, both cameras have a slight stuttery look to the video that many of these cameras have, and it's only made worse by the lack of any image stabilization. Still, despite all the problems, neither of these cameras have the worst image quality I've seen. In some situations, the video can look okay. But those situations are going to be limited by the fact that they lack image stabilization, they lack optical zoom, they have poor low light performance, they have fixed focus, they have stepping and pulsing auto exposure, they lack manual exposure, they have poor quality lenses, and more. And image quality is only part of the story. Don't forget the cheap build, the fake features, the false advertising, the poor audio quality, and the potential compatibility issues with the files that you get from this camcorder. So even considering the somewhat low cost, these cameras are still a poor value considering what else is available these days. So please take the ads and the positive reviews on Amazon with a huge block of salt. So if you have any questions or if there's anything else you'd like me to test out with these cameras, let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care.